Sehr geehrter, lieber, liebgewonnener
Honored Andrei Ivanovich Moisenko,
lieber Freund Aloisi
dear friend Aloisi Machak,
liebe Lena Sarah Karlebach,
dear Lena Sarah Karlebach,
liebe Angehörige
relatives
von Opfern des KZ Buchenwald,
of victims of Buchenwald concentration camp,
Kerkeling,
dear Happy Kerkeling,
sehr geehrter Herr Landtagspräsident,
President of the State Parliament,
König,
Dr. König,
sehr geehrter Herr Minister und
Minister and Deputy Minister President
Georg Mayer,
Georg Mayer,
sehr verehrter Herr Kulturstaatsminister
Minister of State for Culture
Weimer,
Dr. Weimer,
lieber
Vice President of the Bundestag
Bodo Ramelow,
Bodo Ramelow,
sehr geehrte Bundestagsvizepräsidentin AD,
the former Vice President of the Bundestag
begrüße
Petra
sehr
Pau.
herzlich den Antisemitismusbeauftragten
I also welcome the Federal Commissioner for Anti-Semitism,
Felix Klein,
Felix Klein.
begrüße sehr herzlich
I very warmly welcome the President of the Thuringian Constitutional Court, Dr. Klaus von der Weyden,
sehr geehrte Mitglieder des
members of the Thuringian State Parliament
sehr geehrter Herr
and
Vizepräsident
Bundestag, Vice President Quasebart,
sehr geehrte Staatssekretäre Vornab,
dear State Secretaries Vornab and Professor Teichert,
hochverehrte Mitglieder des Diplomaten,
representatives of the Diplomatic Corps,
sehr geehrter Herr Oberbürgermeister
Mayor
Kleine,
Kleine,
sehr geehrter Abgeordneter Nüssle, sehr geehrte Vertreter
Mr. Nüssle,
der
representatives
Glaubensgemeinschaft,
of the religious communities.
besonders begrüße ich
I particularly welcome Reinhard Schramm of the Jewish
Bischof
State
Kramer,
Community and Bishop
Bischof Nallmeier,
Kramer, Bishop Neimeyer,
Brotmann,
and Mr. Brotman
sehr geehrte Vertreterinnen
of the Central Council of the Jews,
Universitäten und den Schulen,
representatives of universities and schools,
sehr geehrte
Mr.
Damen
Marx,
und Herren,
ladies
liebe Mitmenschen,
and gentlemen.
sehr, sehr herzlich begrüße ich Sie
I
alle
welcome you very warmly
zum 81. Jahrestag der
to the
Befreiung.
commemoration of the 81st anniversary of the liberation
Danke Ihnen wirklich
at
sehr,
Buchenwald Memorial.
dass Sie
I
alle
thank you all very much for being here
den Überlebenden und ihren
to
Angehörigen
remember, together with the survivors and their
an
relatives,
das Geschehen vor 81
and to
Jahren
recall
erinnern
the
und
events
die Menschen
that took place here 81 years ago, and to honor those who did not survive the Buchenwald concentration camp. 56,000 men, women and children,
politische Häftlinge
political prisoners from all parts of Europe,
Jüdinnen und
Jews,
Sinti und
Sinti
Roma,
and Roma,
sowjetische Kriegsgefangene,
Soviet prisoners of war,
Zwangsarbeiterinnen,
forced laborers,
als Homosexuelle,
those deported to Buchenwald as homosexuals, asocials or so-called professional criminals,
und auch Zeugen
and also Jehovah's Witnesses.
Ihnen allen
To
mit
all of them,
unser Gedenken.
we pay our respectful tribute.
Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren,
Ladies and gentlemen,
findet leider Gottes
unfortunately our commemorative event is taking place in a difficult political context. What we feared years ago is now becoming very obvious, with fewer and fewer survivors of Nazi terror who can speak out for themselves. The more memorial sites and the culture of remembrance are increasingly becoming misused as a stage for current political disputes with specific agendas and attempts at self-promotion, especially Buchenwald, with its high political symbolic value, is experiencing this repeatedly. What used to be democratic consensus years ago is increasingly coming under pressure. Far-right extremists are attacking the culture of remembrance, defaming it as a culture of guilt, and are speaking of national masochism, which is mentioned, by the way, also in the electoral programme of the AfD in Saxony-Anhalt. And nonetheless, and maybe precisely because of this, they are supported by up to 40% of people in Thuringia. They are given a boost by politicians such as Trump and Putin, who are jointly putting pressure on liberal Europe. At the same time, we observe that even at the centre of society, awareness is decreasing of the importance of critically engaging with Nazi crimes for our self-understanding and democracy. We all saw this last year before the federal elections. Even democratic parties are unashamedly inciting hatred against immigrants. And issues such as gender equality, the fight against climate change, or commitment to queer lifestyles are being demonized as left-wing woke. We're witnessing a culture war against the spirit of the Enlightenment and a rollback of the culture of remembrance, entirely in line with the new right's meta-politics. And the work of memorial sites and the critical examination of Nazi crimes are also coming attack from other arenas. Last year already, we saw how the conflicts in the Middle East and the many victims overshadowed the commemoration events marking the 80th anniversary. This year, in the weeks leading up to the event, applications for public gatherings were received from left-wing, authoritarian and, in some cases, anti-Semitic groups. They wanted to hijack today's commemoration for their own political ends. I thought long and hard about whether I should go into this in more detail. The answer is no. Let us not allow these groups to overshadow today's commemoration. Let us work together to ensure that the commemoration can be celebrated with dignity. A commemoration which should focus on those who are our guests of honour today, the survivors and, not to be forgotten, the relatives of former prisoners. Therefore, let me repeat, a very, very warm welcome to all of you. Because we have a commemorative event, I want to focus on former prisoners and their families. I would like to ask everyone present, therefore, to not disrupt our commemorative event. Please respect the rule against displaying banners or national flags and help us to organize a dignified commemorative event in which the survivors and the relatives can take center stage. This is exactly what Naftali Fürst wrote to me yesterday, the former president of the International Committee Buchenwald-Dora, a Jewish survivor of Buchenwald concentration camp who lives in Haifa. And he wrote to me yesterday, Buchenwald is a fundamentally political and historical site, but not a political stage. On behalf of the relatives, I very warmly welcome Happy Kerkeling. He'll tell us the story of his grandfather, who survived Buchenwald concentration camp as a communist and as Catholic. Dear Mr. Kerkeling, it's a particular honor for us that you are delivering the main address today, and thank you very much in advance. Dear guests, due to the Iranian missile attacks on Israel, it's unfortunate that no survivors from Israel were able to travel here this year. Flights that had long been booked have all been cancelled. However, our thoughts are with Naftali Fürst, Laszlo Mando, Zeev Borger and Michael Ulrich, who had actually planned to be here as guests. Let's hope that they'll be able to join us again next year. And we take this opportunity to send them and their families our very best wishes. Two survivors are present here today. Our friends Andrei Moisenko from Belarus and Aloji Mazak from Poland. A very special welcome to both of you. Allow me to briefly introduce our two guests. Andrei Ivanovich Moisenko was born in 1926 in Chernihiv Oblast in what is now Ukraine. For many years he has lived in Minsk in Belarus. Andrei Ivanovich grew up on a collective farm in a village. He lost his mother at an early age. His father was killed in the war in 1941, shortly after the German invasion of the Soviet Union. Soon afterwards, the Wehrmacht occupied Ukraine, and he was looking for food for his 7 siblings. He was apprehended by German soldiers and deported as a forced labourer to the German Reich, to Leipzig. There, he was forced to work for the company Hazak, In February 1944, the Gestapo arrested him. The charge was that he was a member of a resistance group. In April 1944, the Gestapo took him to Buchenwald, where he was forced to perform hard labour in the quarry. He was then sent to the Wansleben satellite camp, where he was liberated on 14th of April 1945 by the American Army. In July 1945, Andrei Ivanovich was conscripted as a soldier to the Red Army and completed his military service in Belarus. And he kind of stayed there. Alongside working in a construction combine and a design office, he finished his schooling and went on to study. Today, he's member of the Minsk History Workshop and is also vice president for Belarus on the International Committee of Livestream and Commandos. And for many years now, he has been a guest of our commemorations in April to mark the anniversary of the liberation. And I can announce, on 1st of May, he will be celebrating his 100th birthday. So that'll be us and many other guests at the German National Theatre in Weimar. I'm not saying happy birthday yet, that's bad luck. Alois Maszak was born in 1928 in Pacina in Poland. He grew up in Warsaw in a family with 3 other children. His brother Richard was stopped on the street by the SS in 1941. He was arrested and deported to Germany. The same fate befell his sister in 1942. Then there was the Warsaw Uprising, which began in 1944. The father of Alois Maszak went underground. His mother was arrested and deported to Ravensbrück, and he himself was also arrested by the Germans. At that point, he was only 16 years old. After being brutally interrogated and beaten, he was taken to Buchenwald via Auschwitz at the end of August 1944. He then spent some time in quarantine in the small camp down there and was then transferred to the Leau satellite camp. There he had to work in the salt mines, very hard labour for the Junkers factory. On the 11th of April 1945, that's when the main camp was liberated, he was sent on a death march by the SS, which only came to end near Dessau, when Alois Maszak was liberated by American soldiers. After his liberation, he returned to Warsaw. He started a family and worked as a civil engineer. Alois Maszak is vice president of the ICPD for Poland, and he too has tirelessly worked to preserve the memory of his fellow prisoners murdered in Buchenwald. We deeply mourn the loss of 2 other guests that were still here last year. One is our friend Renaud. For many years he always travelled from France to Buchenwald. He died mid-January at the proud age of 102. And only a few days later we had to say goodbye to Gilberto Salmoni. He was the Italian vice president of the ICPD and a member of the advisory board of former prisoners of Buchenwald concentration camp. He died on 1st of February at the age of 97. Dear guests, I'd ask you to observe a brief minute's silence for Raymond Renaud and Gilberto Salmoni, as well as all the other former prisoners who have passed away in the past year. Thank you. On the 11th of April 1945, 81 years ago yesterday, 21,000 prisoners at Buchenwald experienced liberation. It was liberation that came from within and also from outside. After the first American tanks had passed through the grounds and most of the SS personnel had fled, courageous members of the camp resistance, predominantly communists, seized control of the camp and the watchtowers. At 3:15, the words, "Comrades, we are free," rang out from the camp loudspeakers, spoken by the camp eldest. On this anniversary of the liberation, let us not forget that alongside the Allied armies, it was the Europe-wide resistance that ensured National Socialism was defeated, and that we live today in a free and democratic society. Resistance against National Socialism is our focus this year, not just today, but throughout the year. For example, on 8th of May, which is the anniversary of the end of the war in Europe, we publish audio stories as examples from Thuringia in many different places, focusing again on the resistance. Unfortunately, since the 1990s, the history of resistance against National Socialism has largely become a marginal topic for the public. This was quite different in the 1980s. In West Germany, following the social-political upheaval of 1968, a broader perspective arose on different forms and different players of resistance against National Socialism. In the GDR, on the other hand, the anti-fascist resistance struggle remained a central historical narrative about National Socialism right up to the end. In consequence, other persecuted groups did not receive as much attention. This changed after German reunification. The focus shifted from resistance activists to various other victims of National Socialism who had long been marginalized. And then there was also greater emphasis on the perpetrators and the interpretation of National Socialism as a consensus dictatorship. This was linked to a debate of the Nazi concept of the Volksgemeinschaft. And last not least, intense debates sprung up surrounding the political and historical assessment of anti-fascism in the GDR political history. That, unfortunately, led some sections of society, including academia and memorial sites, to discredit the resistance in toto. Only in recent years have we seen renewed efforts to re-examine the resistance from different perspectives, for example, through research into women in the resistance. These new perspectives are also important when it comes to fighting reinterpretations and decontextualizations of resistance against National Socialism in society. We saw examples of that, for example, during the COVID pandemic, where protective measures were ahistorically compared to Nazi dictatorship. You probably all remember the yellow stars, so-called Jewish stars, with the inscription unvaccinated, or a so-called student called Jana from Kassel, who saw herself as a reincarnation of Sophie Scholl and claimed that she was part of the resistance against the COVID dictatorship. So here we saw the growing misuse of the memory of Nazi crimes. On 19th of April 1945, just over a week after the liberation, the survivors of the Buchenwald concentration camp swore here on the former roll call square to work towards a world of peace and freedom. Behind me you can see a photograph of that first commemorative event, 19th of April 1945. So what's left of that wish for peace and freedom? In the face of global wars and the rise of authoritarian and nationalist movements and regimes, many of us might feel that this aspiration and the demand for respect for human rights may seem an illusion. It is therefore all the more important that we oppose these movements with an awareness of history and, supported by science and guided by a clear ethical compass, work hard to ensure that we live in a humane, united and free society in which, as stipulated in Article 1 of the German Constitution, human dignity shall be inviolable. The dignity of all humans, not just Germans. This was also the wish of the social democratic resistance fighter, Buchenwald survivor and former Thuringian Minister-President Hermann Brill. He was one of 11 delegates who drafted the first version of the German constitution at Herrenchiemsee in Bavaria in 1948. And even there, in that draft, but brought in by Hermann Brill, the inviolability of human dignity, was phrased slightly differently then, was top of the agenda. Hermann Brill and the many other men and women who showed resistance against the Nazis in Buchenwald and its satellite camps, we owe them great thanks. Let us honor their memory. Let me now give the floor to Lena Sarah-Karlebach, President of the ICBD. We'll then hear welcoming remarks from Thaddeus König, President of the State Parliament, and Minister of State for Culture, Mr. Weimar, followed by the address of Happe Kerkeling, which we're all very much looking forward to. Once again, my heartfelt thanks to you all for being here. And once again, a very warm welcome to you all.
Mr. Moisenko, dear Mr. Maciak, Professor Dr. Jens Christian Wagner, dear relatives of the former prisoners of the Buchenwald concentration camp, Mr. Kabeling, representatives of the federal government of the Free State of Thuringia, representatives of the diplomatic corps, representatives of the religious communities, dear friends. It is a particular honor for me to address you for the first time as President of the International Committee Buchenwald-Dora and Commandos on the occasion of the 81st anniversary of the liberation and self-liberation of the Buchenwald concentration camp. This moment is particularly moving for me because my family history is deeply intertwined with the persecution, deportation and internment of political opponents and with the extermination of Jewish people. 81 years ago now, on 11th April 1945, my grandfather, Emil Karlebach, a Jewish and communist resistance fighter, experienced the hard-won liberation here at Buchenwald. The Nazi regime cost him 11 years of his life in various prisons and concentration camps. Here, on this site, 81 years ago, he had to remain hidden for several days and nights in the mud beneath the floorboards of Block 56 in order to escape at the last moment from execution by the SS. It is only because he could rely on the solidarity of his comrades. And only for that reason, ladies and gentlemen, I can stand here today as his granddaughter. We stand here at a site that symbolizes a low point in human history. Here people were reduced to numbers, they were mistreated, tortured, exterminated. Their future was to be destroyed and their voices silenced. But we must not remain silent. We are here today not only because of the horrors that took place here, but because even here some aspects of humanity prevailed. Because even here, in a fascist world where every effort was made to suppress solidarity amongst people, even here people stood in solidarity, united and resisted. As I say these words, I also think of the Jewish prisoner Claude Asser, who received extra food through his block elder and was thus able to better endure the 16 months of forced labor he had to perform in the quarry. I think of Elie Buzin, a Polish youth of Jewish origin who had arrived at Buchenwald following the liquidation of Auschwitz and gave his belt to his fellow prisoner Armin Bulwer so that his trousers wouldn't slip down. Or I think of Lily Ebert, who was forced to perform hard labor in a satellite camp near Altenburg and who, whilst checking the ammunition, placed the faulty items into the box of the functional ones. I think of Anna Petschenik, who in the Magdeburg Polte satellite camp in 1944 defiantly addressed words of encouragement to her fellow prisoners. They all surely knew that their resistance might not topple the SS system in the camp, but they also knew that not to resist would mean having lost already. So this courage, and their resistance is our obligation. The people who had to suffer Buchenwald are now almost no longer among us. But we are fortunate to still have a few former prisoners among us, who were children at the time. These children from back then know that they owe their lives in a merciless world to solidarity, fellow human kindness and resistance. And us? What have we made of the legacy of resistance? What does resistance mean to us today? The Karlebach family were a family of rabbis, and in the Jewish tradition there is a commandment, Zachor, remember. Remembering does not mean preserving the past like in an archive. We, in particular, most of whom given our age are unable to remember the period of German fascism as we did not live through it. But we must find other ways of commemorating. Remembering doesn't mean merely speaking or giving warnings. For us today, remembering must mean confronting, without any shame or fear, the crimes of Nazi Germany. To understand how people could become perpetrators, and to understand how people were turned into persecutees. And, ladies and gentlemen, remembering also means proving ourselves worthy of this past through our actions. We're witnessing in Germany and throughout Europe, but also worldwide, discourses that call for exclusion. We're observing a sharp rise in anti-Semitism. It does not disappear, it transforms, it adapts, it speaks new languages, but it always fulfills the same function, which is offering simplistic solutions to complex challenges by singling out a scapegoat. We are witnessing racism, anti-Semitism, and other inhuman attitudes that are steadily on the rise. We see how democracies worldwide are under threat in their diversity, and how civil society engagement is coming under increasing pressure. We see that there is fear and that it is being spread. And we see political forces in democratic countries, such as the largely far-right AfD party in Germany, as well as numerous other movements and parties in Europe, and Trumpism in the US, capitalizing on this fear. We are also observing more subtle shifts. When culture comes under suspicion, when thoughts are censored, something that we're witnessing in Germany today, and I say this with utmost respect for you and your role, Mr. Minister of State for Culture. When bookshops are discredited without further explanation, then something begins to shake. History has taught us catastrophes do not begin with screams. They begin with shifts, with words that are tolerated, with approaches that are accepted, with silence that we justify. So what can we do? First of all, I think we should seek to understand and take an interest in who these resistance fighters were. Also think about the fighters of the International Brigades in Spain. At first, here they were first German anti-fascists, later people from all over Europe who organized themselves, who protected, helped and rescued others, risking their own lives in the process, and all too often losing them. There were no abstract heroes. They were exhausted, persecuted, threatened people who wanted to remain human and who were able to stand in solidarity. They, people such as Willy Schmidt, Erich Loch, Hermann Kerkeling, Eva Farhedi Pustai, Jacqueline Fleury, Pedro Morechan, Pierre Durand, Marcel Paul, Antonin Kalina, and many more. They all proved that even under extreme conditions, a united way of acting remains possible. And this also means, for us, there is no excuse. We do not live in a camp. In our democratic societies, we have rights, institutions, and words. So let us ask ourselves, what does the word resistance mean today? Perhaps it means to refuse simplification, not to accept enemy stereotypes, even if they seem reassuring, to defend the dignity of every human being, to protect places of culture, knowledge and remembrance, to speak out and take a stand against exclusion and the falsification of history, even when it is uncomfortable. Here, on this side, where thousands of marginalized people were tortured, here we must unite today so that nothing like this ever happens again. With courage, with refusal, with solidarity. These are the tools of a humane society. The resistance fighters of Buchenwald and commandos did not merely fight for survival. Until the very end, they also defended an idea of humanity. So it's up to us whether this vision remains a memory or it becomes a commitment. Perhaps here, in the spirit of the Buchenwald Oath made by the prisoners, we can formulate a promise of our own. We will be worthy of your resistance. And the fact that so many of you are here today is part of that promise. Thank you.
Honored Ms. Karlebach, Professor Wagner, first of all, thank you very much for your clear words and statements, and thank you for allowing me to speak here today. Mr. Kerkeling, State Minister Wolfram Weimar, it's an important sign that you are here today in order to underscore the importance of this place. The survivors, Mr. Moichenko and Mr. Machak, and family members of survivors and those who were murdered in Buchenwald. Honored representatives of international associations of victims, of the state government, federal parliament, dear guests. Ladies and gentlemen, there are places where language reaches its limits, places where the voice catches, where the head actually refuses to grasp what has actually happened here, what people can do to other people. Buchenwald is a place like that. And nonetheless, we need to do exactly that. We need to open our eyes wide and look at the place where nearly innumerable people were humiliated, tortured, and many of them were killed. And we need to allow ourselves to think that it wasn't just here that the unthinkable was committed. That horror was an everyday occurrence in the public, at the workplace, and right here on this square it became a crime that had never happened before. From my offices in the Thuringian State Parliament, I can see the bell tower in Buchenwald, and very often I speak of this in speeches I give to the Parliament, because it is the responsibility of today's members of the State Parliament to keep the memory of what happened here alive. You, the survivors, have come here today from Poland and from Belarus. It wasn't possible to travel here from Israel, but you came here as silent witnesses of crimes that we never ever want to allow to happen again. I thank you for this. I'm convinced that we all have to find words to describe what happened here. And we need to find words for what we need to do so that what happened here and at hundreds of other places in Germany and Europe never happens again. I therefore thank you, the family members of survivors and those who died here, that you have travelled here today in order to commemorate events here with us today, because you carry memories into today's world. And therefore also thank you to Mr. Kerkeling and Ms. Karlebach as representatives of the next generations of survivors and people who died at Buchenwald. And I thank you, Mr. Kerkeling, that you are going to speak about your grandfather today, who survived 12 years of Nazi imprisonment, 3 years of which was spent here in Buchenwald. Ladies and gentlemen, today we commemorate the liberation of Buchenwald concentration camp 81 years ago. It was an important step en route to liberation of Germany and an important step in ridding the world of Nazi rule. So we commemorate the millions of people who during the 12 years of Nazi rule found death and sadness. Just in Buchenwald and its satellite camps, more than 56,000 people were murdered up until the last days of the war. Shortly before liberation, 28,000 prisoners were sent on death marches, which cost thousands of them their lives. Commemorating liberation is closely linked to remembering the courage of prisoners who organized resistance, who had already managed to gain control of parts of the camp when the Americans reached the camp in the afternoon of the 11th of April 1945. They found more than 21,000 persons still here. A lot of them were sick and exhausted. All these numbers are hard to grasp, and especially that is why they cannot remain abstract, because behind each one of these figures is a person, a life, a name. For many people, their future ended brutally here in Buchenwald. People were extinguished, their futures were extinguished. Ladies and gentlemen, Buchenwald also reminds us that inhumanity doesn't just begin where violence takes on extreme forms and becomes visible to everyone. It begins with images of enemies, with exclusion, with derogatory language. It began with the attempt to divide people into those that belonged and others that did not, and were excluded. Therefore, our commemoration here always also addresses the present, because we also witness tendencies that are worrying. Ladies and gentlemen, like many others, I am shocked by the extreme anti-Semitic thinking and the increase of this in our society, in particular amongst younger people, especially after the awful massacre of the Hamas on 7th of October 2023 in Israel. Anti-Semitic codes, racist ascriptions and authoritarian patterns of thought are reappearing with a clarity that we cannot ignore. This is not a marginal phenomenon, it is a signal of warning, because if the speeches of if Nazi speech can be heard again on schoolyards, this is not something that affects a school, it is something that affects our democratic culture as a whole. It's therefore important that the state government has put forward a proposal to make such speeches and acts into a crime and to be able to pursue it as such. But this cannot be the only step. We have to make clear the value we ascribe to our democracy, which is one of the biggest achievements of the past. Political education is one prerequisite to understanding freedom and to defending it. We have a constitutional quarter of an hour, which has been introduced in many schools in Thuringia, which is trying to do exactly that. I also try to make my own contribution by visiting schools in order to talk to students about the value of our democracy and to also invite students to the state parliament. Ladies and gentlemen, we are also experiencing that the Buchenwald Memorial Foundation is coming under increasing pressure. Mr. Wagner has already mentioned this. There's a lack of respect, disturbances, damage, and even attacks on people. This does not just only affect symbols or buildings, it actually is directed against the historical conscience of our country. That is why places like Buchenwald don't just need respect, but consolidated protection, because they preserve history and create awareness of our historical responsibility. This place of remembrance was attacked, and that attacks our memory. I want to say very clearly that Buchenwald, remembering what happened in Buchenwald, is a standalone fact. It must not be instrumentalized for other political goals. If it is related to other ongoing conflicts, then we misunderstand our historical responsibility. The city of Weimar decided 2 weeks ago that a demonstration should not be taking place here, but in Weimar itself. We support this decision wholeheartedly. History loses its power if it is only used as a foil for political comparisons. Ladies and gentlemen, maybe this is the most important lesson that comes from this place. Remembrance loses its power if it isn't staying alive, because the most important aspect of commemoration isn't a commemorative event as such, but it's how we can translate it into everyday activities. If people of different beliefs, skin colors, etc. are being excluded, if anti-Semitism is becoming louder again, when racist speech is becoming commonplace, and where simple answers contain derogation, then we have to be clear that exclusion begins just there, with language. And that is why responsibility today means to not just remember, but showing a certain courage and attitude, to draw lines clearly and to contradict, even though it is uncomfortable, to contradict your friends maybe, your families. Exclusion of people must never again become a guiding principle for how we as society act. Ladies and gentlemen, there are places where language seems to fail. But silence would be the wrong answer. We need to speak out. We need to remember. We need to act so that people never ever stop being people. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is difficult to speak at a place like this. A place of horror, a place of individual crimes. And it's not a merely duty, and please respect the dignity of this place and this day. Mr. Moisenko, you just said that you will be 100 years old, and you told me that you will spend your birthday with maintaining the memory and keeping up the remembrance of this place, which makes you survive. In Germany, will not be able to succeed, and this government, we as the country, we will maintain this remembrance culture also in the following years, just as you decided that for yourself, Mr. Moisenko. You're a wonderful person. You're a wonderful person with a great big heart, and you had a terrible experience, but you turned it into a constructive life of remembrance, which is exemplary and which touches a lot of people, and I want to thank you for that. I want to thank you. If you're a victim, if you're a survivor, it's not, you can't take it for granted to come here and to face the past, but you did. And before, we're talking about Naftali first. We know him. The quote that we cannot survive what has lived here. I'm convinced that we are embers that do not burn up in the great fire. And so this is a kind of pain for all of us, and therefore it's important that we stand for the remembrance in your presence here and for dignity. And I kindly ask you to respect the dignity of this place, because of the dignity of the victims. And the dignity itself, it's about an important sign that we want to keep alive the remembrance of the Nazi crimes. There is no possibility for forgetting, and it's important to learn from history, but this means not only that we deduce the never again from the horrors, but I also heard that miracles of humankind came here. Viktor Frankl wrote once, everything can be taken from man except the last of this freedom, to hold on to this own attitude and follow its own path, whatever circumstance. And what happened here, among the other places in Block 66, one of the two children's blocks in the concentration camp, touches me deeply, because it was an unshakable human attitude that saved 900 children in Buchenwald from death. Political prisoners, including quite many Jews, created spaces within the children's blocks where survival was made possible. They registered some of the Jewish boys as political prisoners in order to save them from extermination. They ensured adequate food and supplies, and even introduced singing together to alleviate the terrible conditions for a new moment. The story of this Block 66 exemplifies how resistance was possible through collaboration with the camp structures and mutual aid within the system. And especially these stories have to be documented and continue to tell. Down there it says on the sign the following generations might stand up and tell, and you stand up and keep telling, and this should be our example. We will remember, and we will remember not only in order to fulfill historical obligation, but what this democracy, what this country really defines in his inner part. This is what we need. We need to reassure, we need to know what happened in order to avoid that it will not happen again, that we know who we were in order to know who we do not want to be. And therefore it makes me angry that here in Germany more and more right-wing attacks happen against the memorials. And therefore I'm really sad if we see the attacks coming here, even threats against the director. And I would like to take this opportunity, dear Jens Christian Wallenberg and the director of the foundation, I want to thank you in my admiration. In addition to your innovative educational and outreach programs, your public stance demonstrates exemplary commitment to the fight against anti-Semitism and right-wing extremism. You and your team are doing outstanding work. Despite the intolerable hostility to which you are subjected. For the security, the Buchenwald Mittelbau-Dora Foundation now spends over 10% of its budget out of necessity, a distressing state of affairs. And I'm equally appalled that pro-Palestinian activists have recently sought to exploit Buchenwald for their hatred against Israel. And not only here, but also on the streets of our cities, we hear openly anti-Semitic hate speech that denies the State of Israel's right to exist, an intolerable development that fills me with the deepest concern. We can see that consistent education remains an immensely important task. How said Margit Friedlander, who remarked shortly before her death, "We must never forget, remembrance alone is not enough." And it's true, remembrance must be directed towards the future. Learning from the past, we must defend the values of our democracy. Tolerance, human dignity, respect for those who live differently and those without faith. We must remain vigilant and speak out when confronted with anti-Semitic tendencies. No political view, no personal conviction justifies intolerant strategies. So we must firmly oppose all forms of anti-Semitism, including that which is disguised as criticism of Israel. And it is so important that you raise your voice and you take your stand. Thank you for that. We have to do this in the name of tolerance, which is not only a passive felt, but which needs to be active and be fought for. Thank you all.
Ladies and gentlemen, honored survivors. When I walk through the gates of Buchenwald today, I don't do this as a public figure. I do it as the grandson of a survivor. I walk the path that my grandfather Hermann Kerkeling was forced to walk from 2nd July 1942 onwards. He was not a man of grand words. He was a man of action. A carpenter from Recklinghausen, who got stuck in, who built structures, who worked with his hands. He was a man who was simply not prepared to look away as darkness descended upon Germany. Yet on 2nd of July 1942 he became a number 6117, a so-called political prisoner. In the eyes of the fascist regime, he was a traitor. Here in Buchenwald, he was tortured, humiliated, and he witnessed countless murders. The fact that he survived this madness is a miracle. To me, his high treason today stands as the ultimate testament to loyalty to humanity. My grandfather Hermann circulated leaflets against Hitler immediately after what the Nazis called their seizure of power in 1933. He didn't fire a shot. He didn't engage in sabotage. He simply wrote, printed and distributed the truth. That cost him 12 years of his life. 12 years. Think about it for a moment. What did you do in the last 12 years? You raised children, pursued careers, you loved, you lived. Hermann was imprisoned. First in what was known as the Hell of Recklinghausen, then in various prisons, and finally here on the Ettersberg. My grandfather was forced to carry out his forced labour here in the property room. In the machine room of dehumanizations, he was made to oversee the plundering of his fellow humans. Watches, wedding rings, glasses, brooches, dentures. Everything was registered as if it was mere stock. And herein lies one of the most bitter lessons of history. Barbarism does not begin with the first shot. It begins when people are reduced to mere numbers in a statistic, where empathy gives way to bookkeeping, and where conscience gives way to meaningless obedience. When my grandfather was liberated here 81 years ago today, in 1945, he was 44 years old. Physically, he was a broken man. He was plagued by illnesses that would never leave him, and by a deep fatigue that no night's sleep would ever cure. He never received any real compensation. After the war, he was fobbed off with a few Deutschmarks. And the most bitter thing of all, his wrongful conviction for high treason was never overturned during his lifetime. In the eyes of the Federal Republic's bureaucracy, the persecuted man remained a convicted criminal. But the hardest thing for us as a family was his leaden silence. This deafening silence was like a wall of glass surrounding his soul. We, his family, could see him, but we could rarely reach him. Maybe he wanted to protect us. He didn't want the cruel, cold and blind hatred of this place to creep into our warm little living room in Recklinghausen. And perhaps he also knew the accusations against the Nazi henchmen were so inconceivable that any normal, feeling person would have to doubt them at first. Many of the survivors of the Nazi dictatorship chose silence for themselves. That may give us, their heirs, a glimpse of the horror of they endured. It was and remains indescribable and unspeakable. We, the citizens of the Federal Republic of Germany, are not to blame for the actions of the past, but we do bear responsibility for the consequences of these actions in the here and now. There is no such thing as a blessing of late birth. There's only the duty of belated understanding. Anyone who claims today that the history of fascism in Germany is a closed chapter has failed to understand that the evil spirits of that time did not remain in the ruins of Buchenwald. They are merely waiting to be reawakened through derogatory language, hateful rhetoric, dull resentment, and everyday indifference. who sees the memory of the victims as a burden forgets that this memory is the only thing that protects us from becoming perpetrators in the future. The voices calling for an end to the culture of remembrance are growing ever louder and more brazen. Drawing a line under remembrance, however, would be drawing a line under our democracy. Human dignity shall be inviolable. Article 1 of the German Basic Law is the direct, set-in-stone response to Buchenwald. It's a response to the property room, the Effektenkammer, the response to the selection process and to the extermination of human beings. Anyone who seeks to suppress this valuable memory, anyone who seeks to belittle this period as just a speck of bird poop in history is attacking our very foundations. A mindset that once again excludes people, divides society and trivializes crimes has no place in this country. And that is a historical necessity. At the gate of Buchenwald stands this terrible phrase, to each his own. What the Nazis meant by this was death for the prisoners and power for us. But we, the descendants, we interpret this differently today. To each his own means inalienable dignity for every human being, freedom for every human being, the right for every human being to be who they are, no matter where they come from, what they believe in, or who they love. It took me a long time to speak about Grandad Hermann's fate. But now the time has come. We, the descendants of the survivors, must be the guardians of memory, not out of bitterness, but out of a deep love for freedom. Democracy is not a gift that one receives once and then possesses. It's a promise that every generation has to defend anew against the temptation to look the other way. For me, Buchenwald is not just an abstract place of remembrance. In a harrowing way, it is part of my family history. And I'm speaking out here today, not least because I'm deeply alarmed by current political developments in our country. When today, forces that defame our culture of remembrance are gaining strength again, it is a slap in the face for all the victims and their descendants. Buchenwald is a permanent warning. Anyone who looks away today or applauds those who seek to rewrite history is complicit. My Grandad Hermann remained silent in order to protect his family. I'm breaking this silence. I'm speaking here today to honor him and all the victims who suffered and died here. And I urge you all, speak out too. Do not allow silence to gain the upper hand once more. Because democracy doesn't live from looking away. It thrives off the courage to face up to reality. Let us work together to ensure that never again does not remain lip service, but becomes our daily guiding principle. Thank you. just heard the Buchenwald song, composed in 1938 by Hermann Leopoldi.
In diesem Zusammenhang über Roland Leopoldi, sein Sohn. Ist heute hier.
Ronald Leopoldi, his son, is here today. It's great that you can be here today. It's a great honor. We'll soon have a minute's silence to honor the 56,000 men, women and children who did not survive Buchenwald. Following that, I would ask the representatives of the state and the diplomatic corps to step forward in order to write the wreaths. After that, it'll be possible for everyone to lay down flowers to honor the Buchenwald prisoners. And I would be very pleased if you don't leave right away, but join us on our walk down to the memorial for the murdered Sinti and Roma, and then on to the memorial for the Jewish prisoners, to commemorate those groups who over decades only played a marginal role when it came to commemorating the victims of Buchenwald. May I ask you now for a minute silence?
Haben Sie ganz herzlichen Dank.
Thank you.